The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening is one of the most polarizing Zelda titles out there. Released in 1993, about a year and a half after A Link to the Past, this one was pretty exciting because it was the first Zelda game to be released on a handheld console, being the Game Boy system. And actually, Zelda turned out to be really good for handheld systems, and Link's Awakening's quality definitely proved that. But with a remake happening in 2019, and a pretty good remake at that, it does sort of raise the question of, does the original still hold up, and did it really need a remake that badly? And we're going to answer both of those in my review of Link's Awakening, but this time on the Game Boy. To start off with, I think it's worth noting that Link's Awakening is more on the scale with A Link to the Past than Zelda 1 or 2, which may seem like an obvious point to make, but I was kind of surprised by it playing through the game originally, because usually when the first handheld game comes out, it usually goes back to the series' origins just a little bit. But that wasn't the case at all, and for this one I was actually really excited playing through it because I could tell that this game actually learned a lot from A Link to the Past, which also brings into some of the game's best elements, which I will get to in a minute. But to get the obvious thing out there right away, the biggest problem with The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening is the items. And that's not to say that it's the same problem as in A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past had way too many items going on, and it got really annoying really fast. The problem here with Link's Awakening is that you only have 2 buttons on the Game Boy, and while obviously this is a system limitation, Link's Awakening doesn't really work around the fact that there is a limitation. But instead, you have to constantly swap out items, and you have no consistency. There are going to be times in this game where you don't need a sword, or you don't need a shield, and it's stuff that you wish you could always have. And there's also stuff that you feel like you should always have. And it kind of makes a confusing situation in the remake, where some parts become much easier because you were able to access more items than you were originally intended to. But in many ways, it felt like that's how the game was supposed to be in the first place, which again makes it feel kind of weird that this game wasn't really made to be for the Game Boy. And also, this game, which is definitely shown in Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy Color, was made to be colorful. But it's on a black and white console, which again is just really weird to me how this game doesn't really feel like a Game Boy game. It feels very distinct from everything else that released on this console, which is both good and bad. But another thing I should mention in this game is the puzzles and the combat, which may seem like 2 points to, well, not connect in the first place, but let me explain. The combat in this game is definitely worse than A Link to the Past, but I would say better than Zelda 1? It's kind of hard to describe, but in this one, I mean, the combat is fine, but again, the items kind of get in the way of the limitations of what you can do with the combat. And also that the sword's range is kind of bad sometimes, and also you'll have bosses that just completely rush you. Actually, not just bosses, but a lot of enemies due to the low invincibility frames in this game. And A Link to the Past had the same problem, but it's a little more present in this one, and also gets really frustrating, especially because you die much more easily in this game. And part of that is because in the original, at least, there wasn't upgraded armor that you could get, but this was added in the deluxe edition. But another thing worth mentioning is the puzzles, in which this entry has probably some of the weakest in my opinion. I can't really think of many of the memorable puzzles from this game, other than the one that many individuals thought they were soft blocked just because of how confusing it was to break the potential soft block. Yeah, that's not a good sign. And also that there are many times where you have to either kill enemies in a certain order, or just kill all the enemies on the screen to move on, or bomb this random wall, move this block. Again, Zelda still had a long way to go before it had legitimately great puzzles. And that is clear all throughout this game, as some of the puzzles are kind of simple and some of them are so complex that I have no idea what is going on. But I think I've exhausted enough of the critiques for this game, so let's talk about the absolute best part of this game: the story. Now, if you've never played or heard much about Link's Awakening before, then you're probably really confused by what I'm saying. I mean, you would think that the Super Nintendo, the home console of the 90s, would have the game with the better story than the black and white handheld console. But you would be surprised, because the story of Link's Awakening is unlike anything I had ever experienced when I played this game. Now, in essence, during this time period, most games had the whole entire thing of game over or just keep moving on, kind of the arcade style of gameplay, and the game wanted you to succeed. But in the case of Link's Awakening, things are a little bit different here, and it's a formula that in many ways I like but also don't like, and we'll get to that in a second. But to start off with, the entire concept of this game is that it's a dream, which usually is pretty stupid in storytelling. I mean, it all being a dream is the most basic cliche ending imaginable, and it results in the character's actions not meaning anything. But this time, they make a dream sequence where the character's actions mean everything. Where if Link wakes up the Windfish, which is his primary goal throughout the entire game, everything on the island dies. And this becomes such an emotional power piece that is used throughout the game, but especially effectively with the final nightmare boss fights. And this had me actually kind of shaking a little bit, because I wasn't sure what would I want to do, especially if I was in Link's shoes in this situation. Obviously, you want to wake up the Windfish to complete the game, but also knowing that everything is going to be gone. It is a literal game over situation, but it's such an interesting choice and decision for the hero to make. And unlike previous entries where Link comes back and is the hero who saves everyone, in this one he ruins it, and in some ways for a selfish reason. And I just find that so fascinating that this game from 1993 could have such an emotionally pulling story that's also very innovative. And it's something that I had never really seen before. So when I played through the remake in 2019, and then later finished the remake in 2021, I really enjoyed the story, and I really loved playing through it again on the Game Boy. But to go back to the question I asked earlier, does The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening need a remake? Well, yeah, it did need a 2019 remake, and that's because of all of the problems I previously mentioned, but also because this story needed to look nicer, it needed to look more presentable, and it needed a reason for everyone to care once again. And that's why I think it needed a remake, but also why I think that this game is still really good. The combat is maybe not as good as Zelda 1 or 2, and the puzzles are about the equivalent of those games, but the story is the thing that puts it ahead, so much so that I kind of want to give it a much better score than I'm actually going to give it. Which is why The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, on Game Boy specifically, I'll get to the remake later, is getting, from me, a 6 out of 10.